Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we want to talk about something we've never talked about on the podcast before. It's a proprietary model we've come up with, and we want to unpack it on today's show. We think it's going to be really helpful for you. And we've only really talked about it, I think, in our profiler training program before, and it's in our book. But today we want to give it to you as a gift here on the show. So I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. And if you're an ENFP or you're an EP at all, you probably resonate with what I'm going to say. I love my freedom. I love to not be pinned down any moment of my life. I've loved it since I was a little kid. I love the option to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, with who I want to do it. I love the ability to be completely free, to the point where I've architected my life so that I can be free. I have my own business along with Antonia. We have a very free-form life. We basically homeschool our daughter so we can travel or go anywhere anytime we want. We have a virtual company, so we don't have like a brick-and-mortar building to have to go to work to every day. We work out of our home, and all of our team lives all around the world, and they work virtually in the company. So we've constructed a life where I pretty much, at this point, have a lot of freedom. Almost 100% freedom in my life, barring any major disasters in the business or my lifestyle. I can do pretty much what I want each day. And it's really interesting because I'm hesitant now at this point to even schedule meetings sometimes far in advance, because I'm worried that if I schedule a meeting far in advance, well, now I'm going to be beholden to something. 3 Thursdays from now, I got to show up to that meeting. What if that day when I get up, I don't feel like going to that meeting? Well, now I'm beholden to somebody else. So I've seen this come up in really interesting ways. Now that I've constructed a life, and Tony and I have constructed a life together that allows almost absolute freedom. I don't think it's 100%, but almost absolute freedom in a lot of ways. I found myself struggling with this. Like, it's actually become a problem in my life, having so much opportunity for so much freedom. Even though freedom has been what some might call a fixation for me throughout my life, and I've worked toward getting the openness of that freedom. Now I'm realizing the limitations of absolute freedom as we've constructed in our lives. And today we want to talk about this, not just my version of this, but you listening probably have a version on your side. So it may not be freedom for you. It might be something else that you're fixated on that's really driving or motivating you based on your personality type. And we want to talk about this today because we think that each of us is wired differently to have a different fixation. And we have something we're looking at that we see as the ultimate or the ideal to work toward. And sometimes that ideal doesn't always serve us when we get it.
Yeah. So we've been coaching people using the Myers-Briggs system for going on a decade now. And as we were coaching people of different types, we started to see trends pop up of different fixations people were experiencing. Unconscious, like these fixations were not things that they were necessarily aware of. And it seemed to trend toward certain similar types had very similar fixations. What's interesting about this idea of Myers-Briggs types having fixations is that it actually kind of sounds almost like something you'd see in the Enneagram. The Enneagram is all about our fixations, our passions and our vices and our virtues and the unconscious puppet masters of our wiring that want us to behave in certain ways. And when we aren't conscious or aware of them, then they pull the strings from behind the curtains. And now our lives are, we end up in imago relationships, and we end up creating the same situations over and over again. And we don't seem to quite learn the lessons from them. And it's because we have these unconscious fixations that until we're aware of what they are and how they influence us, we can't really do much about them. And so when I was looking at these trends of fixations that people of different Myers-Briggs types had, I asked myself, or we were asking ourselves, you and I, Joel, is there a similar set of fixations that are attached to people's Myers-Briggs types, not just their Enneagram types? So we've been working on a proprietary model here at Personality Hacker for about the last 4 or 5 years that may describe what people's fixations are based on their Myers-Briggs type. And not just their Myers-Briggs type, but very specifically which cognitive functions are in what what part of the stack for them. So if you're unfamiliar with the term cognitive functions, if this is the first time you've heard our podcast, please feel free to check out. Just go to personalityhacker.com and in the search field, write in CAR model or cognitive functions, and you'll find a bunch of resources, articles, and podcasts we've recorded in the past on the subject. But if you are familiar with cognitive functions, and in particular the CAR model, we noticed that people's fixations based on their Myers-Briggs type was oftentimes easiest to identify based on their relationship with their driver or their dominant function. And the trend is this. When you have an extroverted perceiving function as a driver function, the fixation tends to be on freedom, just like Joel was talking about as an ENFP. So this would be all EPs, right? All EPs have an extroverted perceiving process, either extroverted intuition or extroverted sensing, what we call exploration and sensation, as their driver function. So all EPs on some level are fixated on freedom. And we'll fillet that out just a little bit on why in a moment. If you are an IJ in the Myers-Briggs system, you're leading with, or your driver function is going to be an introverted perceiving function. So either introverted intuition or introverted sensing, or what we call perspectives or memory. If you lead with an introverted perceiving function, then your fixation tends to be on being invulnerable. The fear is that you'll be vulnerable, and the fixation is on how do I become invulnerable to attack. And again, we'll fillet that out in just a moment. If you are an IP in the Myers-Briggs system, you will be leading with an introverted judging function. So either introverted thinking or introverted feeling. We call them accuracy and authenticity. If you are an IP, then your fixation tends to be on being right or justifying the conclusions your introverted judging function has come to. And if you are an EJ in the Myers-Briggs system, extroverted judging, you're going to lead with an extroverted judging function, either extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling. We call them effectiveness and harmony. And if you are leading with one of those two functions, then your fixation will tend to be on management or on control.
So obviously each of these is grouped in sets of 4. There are 4 EPs, 4 IJs, 4 IPs, and 4 EJs. That gets us our 16 types in the Myers-Briggs system. And if you look at freedom, invulnerability, rightness, and management, it creates a little acronym, which is what we call the FIRM model, FIRM, freedom, invulnerability, rightness, and management. So it's a quick little acronym for you to have in your mind as we talk about this, as we start to unpack some of the reasons why and some of the nuances around this. Have that acronym of freedom, invulnerability, rightness, and management in your head as we talk about it.
So why do these fixations happen? Well, usually it's because the function itself needs certain things in order to operate. For extroverted perceiving functions like sensation and exploration, they need an amount of freedom to be able to operate, right? You need to be able to explore your terrain and your territory, to engage with your environment, to be able to be in your body or in conversation. There are certain needs that both of these functions have in order to operate at all. But if they find themselves in a context that is limiting, that prevents them from being able to explore or to be fully in their body, if they're in a situation where they're constantly told to sit down, stop messing with things, sit on your hands, don't touch, don't talk about those subjects, whatever it is that is limiting to the function may create an appetite that never quite gets sated. And then the fixation is birthed through this appetite that is constantly being told, no, go away, go away, go away. And so the fixations aren't necessarily native, like the idea of a fixation, something that you can't get out of your mind, something that now is controlling you as opposed to you're controlling it. It's not as if the functions themselves are fixated, but rather the fixation is birthed through the functions never getting what they need in order to fully operate, right? To completely mature, to become what they know they can become. And so the fixation becomes a way it's almost like if you're starving, you're always on the lookout for food. If you can't ever quite, sate your appetite, you're always looking for ways to try to sate your appetite. So the fixation is emergent of a system that is marginalizing or shoving the needs of that driver or dominant function to the side.
I would also say that the fixation can also come from indulging it over and over again. I think this is where I'm coming from. Like, obviously, I don't have a problem with it. I think it's something that I've been a challenge with, the freedom piece, but it comes from you keep pursuing freedom, and it's like this inattainable thing you can never grasp. So the fixation isn't necessarily always from getting denied the fixation. Sometimes it can come from you being able to go toward it, hoping it'll meet some other need, and it never does. And so you continually stay fixated on it because you're just, I just need a little bit more freedom. Like, just for this example, for the EPs, right? Or I just need a little more invulnerability, or whatever it is. Like, I just need a little bit more. I've indulged. I just need a little bit more, and you can never be sated from it.
Right. And it's because the dream of complete unfettered freedom it doesn't exist. If you get it, then actually the context itself is limiting, because freedom actually operates the best in a situation that has some boundaries. And so if it's almost like you get, I don't know, like there's that concept of the blank page syndrome. If you have complete and total freedom to write about anything, it's almost like your mind gets bottlenecked, and you can't think of any one thing to then be creative around. And so this sense of unfettered freedom, where you're able to do, like you were saying, anything you want, anytime you want, with whomever you want, that doesn't really exist in reality. And so if you either are starving, right, which is the example I used, or if you are overindulged or spoiled, then that will also create an appetite, right? Being overindulged will create an appetite that also can't be sated, because it's actually balance you're looking for. And so what could have started through either neglect or through overindulgence then becomes a fixation. And each EP type experiences it a little differently. Not all EPs are focused on the same style of freedom. What we're noticing is that each personality type, or each of the 4 EP types, has like a slightly different relationship with freedom. Like ESTPs tend to want freedom of motion or movement. They want full physical sovereignty to be able to go wherever they want to go, whenever they want to go. ESFPs tend to want the freedom to play and pursue pleasure. They want the freedom to be able to act in a way that's rewarding. ENTPs want freedom of thought without social pressure to conform. They want to be able to talk about whatever ideas are coming to them. And ENFPs have a desire to perform and express themselves without constraint. And in a world, when little kids are growing up, in a world of adults that are trying to socialize the children and, help them become, good adults themselves, right? Train them to become productive members of society. Sometimes EP's behavior seems very out of control to adults. It feels it feels the opposite of socialized, right? Because if you want full freedom to do whatever you want to, well, a little ESTP could be destructive because they want the ability to run around and play with things, and they might end up being destructive of their own body, right? Because they're pushing the limitations of their body, so they might end up with a lot of bumps and bruises or broken bones as they're growing up, and that can be very distressing to adults. So as opposed to allowing them to learn through that and find their own boundaries, adults have a tendency to want to put those boundaries, like much, much tighter boundaries on EPs than EPs themselves operate the best within. This is one of the reasons why EPs have a tendency to be called ADD in school, because they need to get up and move, right? They need to be able to talk a lot and share ideas and get into their bodies and have adrenaline, induced situations or experiences. And so for an EP that is told perpetually, no, sit down, no, you have to be, you can't say that. That's something that EPs hear a lot. You can't say that. Well, being told you can't say that makes you want to just avoid any situation that will tell you can't say that, right? As opposed to fighting against the system, quote unquote. EPs then learn, well, just avoid those situations. So then they have a tendency to become highly avoidant of anything that tries to create any constraint around them. And because of that, then situations that feel binding or constraining become quickly intolerable, especially if the EP is currently fixated on freedom. Not just desiring it, not wanting to create a life of freedom, but if the desire for freedom is controlling them, which is what happens with the fixation, then the EP will then leave relationships if they feel too binding, or they'll leave jobs if the job doesn't give them the freedom that they're looking for. They might actually end up sabotaging things in their life because the situation is reminding them of that feeling that they had maybe in childhood when the fixation started to grow. And then they end up, maybe getting 80% of the way into a project, not finishing it, and then being unable to bear the fruits of it. So it can actually become a real problem for EPs, constantly looking for this concept of unfettered freedom, especially if they're fixated on it, because it's not really something that can exist anyway. But if they don't know how to nourish that part of their driver or dominant function, which there are many healthy ways to nurture it and to grow it and mature it and allow it to be something that's, positive in their life, that sense of freedom and joie de vivre is oftentimes what's so attractive about them. But if they don't have a way themselves to self-regulate, then they end up unintentionally destroying the things in their life because they're so focused on getting this need met.
Don't get too hung up on the specific way this might express for each of the EP types. You might resonate with one. You're like, well, I'm not an ENTP, but I really resonated with the idea to be free with my thought. There are crossovers here, so don't take it as the gospel that this is exactly how it works for everybody that's of that type. But these are trends and typical ways that they show up that we've observed through coaching and some of the work we've done in the past few years. And I think it's very helpful to start. I mean, if you're an EP, you're probably already resonating with some of the things we've already said. And if you have an EP in your life, let's say a spouse, a lover, a friend, a parent, a child, you're probably noticing some of the things we just talked about. Like, wow, they do have a drive for freedom. There does seem to be a fixation there or a compulsion for it in a way. Let's talk about IJs. So IJs, remember, it's freedom, invulnerability for IJs. So these are all INTJs, INFJs, ISTJs, ISFJs. And remember that IJs are leading with an introverted perceiving process. So either perspectives, introverted intuition, if they're intuitive, or memory. These are nicknames we call them, which is introverted sensing, the technical name for the ISJs, sensors. And introverted perceiving is a perceiving process. This is the driver of all these types. And it is, I guess you could call it more of a post-processing perceiving cognitive function. So what happens is the IJ moves through the world, picks up a lot of information, picks up all the different, intuitive information or sensory information. And then over time, after it goes inside, the IJ then sorts through that and processes all of the things that they've picked up. Well, that's a very risky proposition because as you move through the world, not everything you run into is positive. Not everything you run into has good intent. Not everything you run into you can handle in your life. So if you pick up everything, which is what you're kind of naturally wired to do, is just this is not a judging function for you as an IJ. This is a perceiving function. You just move through and pick up whatever's there. If you're not careful, icky stuff can get inside of you, right? Icky stuff can get in there. Now you got to sort through and expend more energy figuring out, what does this mean? Where does this get sorted? How do I see this or perceive this in my life? And so what IJs do is they create a level of invulnerability to keep those things at bay, to stop those from coming in through that introverted perceiving process. And so the fixation here then is, how do I create boundaries, borders, and protections against stuff coming into my perceiving process that I don't know if I got the energy, the resource, or the wherewithal to handle. So that's why there's an invulnerability to the IJs. So that's the fear, right? That stuff's going to come in. And the fantasy is that there is an impenetrable wall. It's impenetrable invulnerability. Nothing will get through that I don't want to get through. I can completely keep it outside of me, and it's ironclad. And this is obviously an ideal. This is the fixation. This is the dream of all IJs, is that they can completely control what comes into their perceiving process at their driver level. Well, obviously, in the world, that can't actually be the case, but that's still something that is desired for you. And it shows up a little different depending on which IJ we're talking about. If we're talking about ISFJs, it's typically the desire to be invulnerable away from conflict. ISFJs really want to keep conflict at bay. ISTJs typically want invulnerability from their feelings, from having feelings put upon them that they don't want to feel inside of themselves. INTJs typically want invulnerability from being controlled. They hate the fact that a system outside themselves they didn't help create or design could have some level of control over them, because that's not how they would do it if they were going to do something. And then INFJs desire invulnerability from other people's emotional pain, because as an INFJ, you're listening, you know that often other people's pain can almost assault you. It can come in and you have to create boundaries and borders and ways to keep that away from yourself. So this is a little bit of how these can show up in the different IJs and how this might show up for you if you're an IJ. Again, don't get tripped up too much on the specifics of which IJ this shows up for, because there is crossover, but this is some of the trends we've observed.
Well, and just like an EP might ditch a relationship that's feeling too constraining, an IJ just won't enter a relationship. And so the things that they truly desire, which is to be understood, to have intimacy, to have the things that every human being wants, an IJ might just create, like you said, those walls, like a spiky outer, sort of visage, to make it so that the things that they don't want to come in just never get an opportunity to do so. And so again, we're talking about less healthy perspectives, right? We're talking about something that has become such a fixation that it's now controlling your behavior, and it does it in very subtle ways. Like for EPs, every time an EP like bolts from a situation that they don't like, they almost always have a laundry list of very, like rational reasons, right? That's a very logical reason for them to leave, because the person blah, 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 or the situation blah, 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 blah. Like they're always going to have like a list of reasons. The same thing for an IJ. They're going to have a list of reasons why they need to be maybe a little spiky, or maybe not leave their house very often, or stay at home a lot. There's always going to be a reason, and it's going to be a good one, right? These things don't come up out of vacuums. There is always going to be very reasonable excuses to attempt to be impenetrable or attempt to be unfettered. But fundamentally, it is the driver or dominant function's desire to get a need met. For perspectives and memory, both of those need to have time to sort, like you mentioned, Joel, to get through whatever it's absorbed, and to be able to deal with it and manage it in a way where they're now learning about life in a safe environment. Because if you're being assaulted too much, there's not a lot of learning you can do there. You're just now having to do a lot of healing. And so the need for both of these functions, introverted sensing and introverted intuition, the need for both of them is to be able to learn about themselves and the world in a safe environment. That's the need. And so there's a lot of reasons why, if somebody has been in hostile environments, they would shut off the outer world's information so that they can just process what's already come at them. So it's understandable. The same thing for EPs. It's understandable why somebody would start to create these behaviors. And unfortunately, the things that we want as humans, right, our basic needs, not just the needs of the dominant or driver function, but our basic human needs of connection, of stability, of creativity, of true freedom, and true, not invulnerability, but the ability to be vulnerable and not hurt in that state. Unfortunately, the fixations end up sabotaging, and we don't get what we want because we're so fixated on the fear that comes along with it. So moving on to IPs, the purpose of the driver function for all the IP types, since it's an introverted judging function, the purpose is to evaluate the worth or merit of information. But because it's an introverted function, it's going to always be subjective. Like the metrics are always going to be internal. For introverted thinking, it's going to be impersonal information or data. And for introverted feeling, it's going to be more personal. But both of them feel very strongly once it's come to a conclusion, because it's sorted. It's not just sorted through the information like introverted intuition or introverted sensing is done. It's actually sorted through it and then determined the value and worth of all this information. It's determined its rightness. Sometimes we call it its shouldness, right? Should it exist? Should life be the way that it is? Should these thoughts be these thoughts, or these feelings be these feelings? And unfortunately, because it's introverted or subjective, there's really no reason for anybody outside of the person using this function to necessarily agree with them, unless there's some form of proof. And so there's that kind of creates a conundrum.
Well, and the other piece too is there's a lot of tie to who this person is tied to how they've come to their conclusion of the should statement. Like there's a sense of themselves wrapped in it. Almost their ego is wrapped in it.
Right. The conclusions come in large part based on note of identity. And so the conundrum becomes for IPs is if they don't develop the ability to persuade others, to quote unquote show their work, so to speak, they find themselves perpetually feeling defensive about those conclusions, right? Like if they can't persuade other people to agree with them, then these things they feel so strong about is very easy to shove aside or to marginalize or go, oh, that's not how that works. And the attempt to explain it to other people then becomes quite, it's fatiguing to try to explain the conclusions. And a lot of times IPs just stop trying. And instead of stopping trying and going, well, I guess I'm not right, they instead go the opposite way and they double down on it without feeling any need to express or explain it to another person. And so that's why IPs then become fixated on being right. It's not necessarily that they think they're always right. It's just that they're tired of trying to defend when they think they're right, why they think they're right. The defense becomes the challenge. And so then IPs become fixated on rightness. They have to be right. And what ends up happening is if you feel like you always have the moral or the intellectual high ground, right? Like you can't be questioned, then other people see from you a smugness that you might not actually be feeling. The fixation isn't on actually being smug. The fixation is on being valid, really. That's the need going unmet for introverted thinking and introverted feeling, is a need to be validated. Even if the thought is wrong for introverted thinking, it needs validation that its thought processes are they should be shared, that they're worthy of being shared with others and considered. For introverted feeling, it's the same way, but with emotions. It needs to be reminded by others that the emotions are valid, right? Like there's a reason why they're feeling what they're feeling. And the more marginalized they get, the less those functions are being fed and the more the fixation shows up. So for ISFPs, the fixation becomes on being blameless. For ISTPs, the fixation becomes on being competent, right? They want to be right through competence. For INTPs, they want rightness of logic. And for INFPs, they want rightness of their ethical position. So again, like Joel mentioned, don't get too caught up on the association with each of these IP types and the specific way it shows up, because if you're an IP, on some level, all of these are going to resonate with you. You're going to want to be blameless. You're going to want to be competent. You're going to want to be logical, and you're going to want to have a good ethical position. But the strategies are there to protect that interest of whatever driver function it is, whether it's introverted thinking or introverted feeling. And what ends up manifesting is that they don't receive feedback from other people that they could be wrong. And so what ends up happening then is that they don't calibrate to outer world feedback. And when they're not calibrating to outer world feedback, then their rightness tends to drift because they're not really putting it through a process of fire, right? They're not really truly vetting it. So then they get further and further actually away from being right. And that's what ends up happening with all of these. The more the fixation causes the person to double down, the further the drift happens from what they ultimately wanted in the first place.
You know, we didn't really talk about it, but that drift happens with EPs and IJs too. I mean, with EPs, let's just assume like an ESFP tends to go, I want to be able to eat whatever I want to eat. I don't want to have to be disciplined around my eating. I want freedom around eating just because it feels good, or drink whatever I want to drink, alcohol or whatever. And they overindulge. Now they might lose their freedom by becoming a prisoner to their body, which starts to degrade, starts to have poor health. And now the freedom they once craved structurally is impossible because they put themselves in a situation through freedom that led them to more of a prison of their own making. And I mean, I started off the podcast talking about this with myself. Like, I've created a life of a lot of freedom. And in some ways, I'm a little bit of a prisoner to it. I have a hard time sometimes getting projects done because I don't have to do them sometimes. I I have a project and there's no like boss breathing down my neck or no external force. There might be some deadlines I've put on myself, or there's something I've promised, but now I've got to find ways to get things done in a prison, quote unquote, of my own making. And that's been a challenge for me. And that's one of the things I've learned in my journey.
Yeah, well, like if you don't get those projects done and they're attached to resource, if they don't get done, then you don't get the resource, and now you can't fund your life anymore.
Exactly. So I ultimately lose the freedom I've built.
Exactly. And I think of like with ISFJs wanting freedom from conflict, sometimes they're so conflict avoidant, or any IJ can be so conflict avoidant that they won't address bad situations. And so then the situation gets worse and worse and worse, right? Because everybody's sort of sweeping everything under the rug. And then eventually you have relationships that are, like that can't be fixed anymore. Like they're permanently broken because they weren't addressed at their root. And so in the avoidance to be vulnerable to conflict, then they've created this this permanent conflict. And that's what happens with all of this, is that that whole concept of Carl Jung's, what we resist persists. When we're so fixated on these things, we are resisting the thing that we believe will get in the way of our driver dominant function's desire. And then we end up sort of creating the situation anyway, because we were so avoidant that we weren't able to just behave in a balanced way.
So let's move over to the last set of 4, the EJs, which are fixated on management. So F, freedom; I, invulnerability; R, rightness; M, management, or sometimes you could swap out management for control. So all EJs in the Myers-Briggs system are using extroverted judging as an extroverted judging process as their driver. So either effectiveness or extroverted thinking, or harmony, extroverted feeling, is the way that they show up to the world primarily as the driver. Both of the extroverted judging processes believe they understand how the world should be working externally. Extroverted thinking or effectiveness believes that they know how resource should be managed, what people should be doing, how projects should be getting done. And extroverted feeling believes they know how everybody's needs should be getting met in a structural way, how we should construct our world socially to ensure everyone is getting their needs met and everyone's taken care of. So they have this ability to see what needs to be happening in the outer world, which is a talent, but it can become a fixation when they don't believe other people are able to get those things done or meet those needs. So they start to question other people's competency on being able to see what to them is obvious. So it's obvious to them, and yet people don't behave in these ways that seem so obvious. So now it's like, well, I don't know if I could trust people. The narrative starts to create in their mind of a distrust of people doing what they should be doing, meeting the needs or getting the things done in the outer world. And because that question comes up for them, are people able to do this? Are they competent? Maybe they're not. I know how to guarantee these things get done or needs get met. I'll just be in control. As long as I'm in control and I can help structure this or help accommodate for this or help build this in the outer world, everything's going to be okay. So this becomes a fixation for them to be in control of their environment. And often this can be overbearing for other people.
Yeah, I don't mean to jump in because I know you're going to talk about the different styles that EJs do this. But what's interesting about the management part of firm for the EJs is that they actually have a twofold fear. The first one is what you mentioned, which is that nobody can do it the way they could do it. And so they've got to jump in there and make it happen for everybody else. But the second fear, which is usually more sublimated, is that the fear is that they're not needed at all. And so they must reinforce their value by creating a system that can't run without them. And so sometimes for EJs, the fear isn't just everybody else is incompetent and they've got to do it themselves. The fear is that nobody needs them, that everything could run without them and nobody would blink. And so that's not feeding their driver function either, because their driver function needs to know it has impact. And so the fear there is either everybody's incompetent or that the EJ will not be able to have impact.
Yeah, and this shows up a little different for all 4 EJ types. ESFJs typically want to manage people's relationships, so that's where their management style goes toward. ESTJs often want to manage the schedule, so there's their own schedule and other people's schedules. ENTJs typically want to manage all the resources and the systems that are set up. And ENFJs want to manage people's emotional experiences. They're very tied into the emotional experience people are having. And again, there's crossover between all of these, but this is typically how it often shows up for the 4 types of EJs in the Myers-Briggs system. And this fixation can also be sabotaging for the EJ. So, I mean, think about if you have control, let's say you have a framework, an external framework set up, and people are inside that. Let's say you are a boss somewhere and you've got a business and you're in control of the people in your business, or maybe you've got a family dynamic or an event that you're in charge of. People are inside your framework and you have tight control. Well, you only have tight control as long as people are inside your framework. People have the option, unless you're like a prison guard or something, they have the option to go outside of your framework. They have the option to quit your employment or to just go away from the family event. And your tight control can sometimes sabotage you by being so tight, people just opt out altogether. And now you don't have the outcome of having the environment at all because people just abandon ship in a way. So as an example, let's say an ESFJ at a family gathering wants 2 people to get along, is trying to force the issue, trying to force this harmony situation between 2 people that may not be getting along. If the forcefulness comes too strong, the people might just select out altogether. They may not show up to the family event if there's an insistence they get along or something like this. So you could see how this can sabotage you by overreaching, just like the other types that we've talked about, or the other fixations. This can go badly if it's too much of a fixation.
Right. So with all 4 of these, for freedom, invulnerability, rightness, and management, ultimately, these are actually healthy desires in our life. Like everybody needs a measure of freedom. We all need to not be sitting ducks to others. We all need, to have our vulnerability honored and to have a defense strategy if somebody is trying to exploit or attack us. We all need to know that we're valid, right? That we have valid points and that we're right about certain things. We need a measure of certainty about our ability to make judgments. And we need some control in our life. We need to be able to manage situations. So it's not the desires that are the challenge or the problem. It's when we become fixated on them because our driver or dominant function is feeling malnourished, is feeling like it's not getting what it needs to be able to operate well. And so when it comes to the firm model, most of the time, the way that these fixations are operating inside of us, they're very unconscious. We don't really recognize it. We might feel their effects on a regular basis. We might feel their effects over and over, because the effects are the emergent of the system running. But if we're not aware of this big node in the system called our fixation, right? If it's entirely unconscious, or if we've figured out a way to validate the fixation itself, right? If we figured out a way to justify it, then we'll find ourselves in these situations over and over and not know how we got there. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that once you recognize that the fixations are not really attached to the driver function so much as the specific driver function, meaning that freedom is attached to extroverted perceiving functions, both sensation and exploration. That's what the freedom fixation is attached to. If you have sensation or exploration in another position in your car model, let's take, for example, it's your 10-year-old function. You're an EJ. And so exploration or sensation is your 10-year-old function. If you're looping, what you'll find yourself doing is you'll find yourself not only fixating on your need to be in management, you'll actually find yourself fixating on the need to be free, because you're now giving too much attention to your 10-year-old function. You're giving it too much weight, and your 10-year-old function now itself needs freedom. The same thing happens when you're in the grip. Let's say, for example, your 3-year-old function or inferior cognitive function is, say, an introverted perceiving function. It's either introverted sensing or memory, or it's introverted intuition or perspectives. Then if you're in the grip, your fear will be that you're vulnerable, and you'll go to a fixation on invulnerability or impenetrable invulnerability. And that's when EPs have a tendency to disappear. Nobody knows where they went. And so the fixations travel with the functions, and you can find yourself getting fixated on whatever is the desire or the unmet need of that function in your car model. But it doesn't happen as often as the driver, because our driver is so influential in our lives. our driver is the function that we are primarily interfacing the world with. And so if it's going with unmet needs, right? Like if it's not getting its energies or, the energetic needs met, if it's not getting the foundational need that it has in order to, manifest well or to mature or to be at its best, then the driver is going to most often be the unconscious fixation that you're experiencing. And you can tell this because you'll be tired a lot. Your life will not feel like it's, it'll feel like you're always sort of in a resistant mode. It'll feel like you're on the defense all the time, that you're always having to sort of fight life to get your needs met. And so the fixations might not be obvious to you, but the results of these fixations are. The results being that defensiveness, that lack of energy, that tiredness, that feeling that it's sort of you against the world. So when you figure out how to construct your life to get the needs met of each of these functions, if you can get your driver's needs met and your co-pilots and your 10-year-olds and your 3-year-olds, if you can figure out how to avoid things like being in a loop, in a driver 10-year-old loop, and we've done podcasts on what those loops look like. If you can figure out ways to get your 3-year-old or inferior functions needs met without getting in the grip, then you won't find these fixations coming up for you as much because they are the result of unmet needs. So if you can get your needs met, then you're okay. One big question people sometimes have is, do you ever get fixated on the co-pilot function? And the answer is yes, but not as often. Generally, that only happens when you have figured out how to make your co-pilot a one-trick pony. So you haven't really developed it. You don't really have a strong, mature co-pilot function. You more have it as sort of a tool you exploit as a one-trick pony. If that's the case, then your co-pilot function will also have unmet needs. And then you'll find your fixation, sort of the fixation of that function also manifesting for you. But most of the time, it's going to show up as a driver, a 10-year-old loop, or an inferior grip fixation. We
all overvalue our own experience in the way that our own brains and hearts are wired. We all think that, it's almost impossible not to do this. It takes a lot of work to see that other people see the world, experience the world, and judge criteria different than us because we just have this assumption that, well, this is how the world is, and most people are seeing it the way I see it. And so the other part of this is not just the fixation for yourself, but there's an assumption that other people have the same desire that you do. So for example, this shows up in my life. So I'm an ENFP, and my fixation often, or the way I see the world, is I want freedom. I want to be free of any kind of structure. That's the ideal. I've learned in my life I can't actually do that. I don't have the freedom there. But in leading a company and a team, often I assume that's the fixation or the desire of everyone else. And so I'll show up to team members, and instead of giving direction or helping, lead in here's what needs to get done, I'm assuming that everybody else wants just as much freedom as I do. And so my management style, the way I show up to lead a team or show up in a meetup or whatever else, is assuming everyone wants as much freedom as I would want in that same situation. And it's something that I've had to learn, is that not everyone's obviously wired like I am, right? And over the years, I've learned people need different things. They don't need what I need necessarily. And so this might also be something that's coming up for you. You might be an EJ. You assume other people want as much control as you do. Or you're an IJ and you're saying, well, man, I can't say that to somebody. That would infringe upon their boundaries or their borders. They might be really vulnerable in that situation, and you protect them when that's really what you would want on your side. Or an IP, thinking in terms of other people wanting their own rightness or their own convictions or something, and honoring that above what they actually wanted. So this can come up for you when you're relating to other people, not just yourself.
Yeah, for IPs, sometimes they get into clashes that, they get into fights that didn't need to exist because they're doubling down on their own rightness, and they're assuming the other person's going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And so then they create a conflict that didn't really need to happen at all. One of my big blind spots is because introverted sensing or memory is my inferior or 3-year-old function. I know there are moments when I need that feeling of invulnerability at times, but it's so rare and it's so not on my radar that I forget that vulnerability is like a big deal for other people. So I've unfortunately stomped and tromped over other people's boundaries, not realizing that the boundaries even existed because they wouldn't have been my boundaries. I wouldn't have even, that's not something that would have been a thing for me. And so that's the other thing that happens, is that because we're overvaluing whatever the thing we need is, or the fixation that we have, and maybe even blind to other people's needs or what has maybe become fixations to them, when we offend that, we don't really give it merit. Like if you marginalize an IP's idea and they, sort of hit back or, just kind of buck at that situation, for me, sometimes it's very easy to go, well, what's the problem? We're just idea generating. I don't know why you're so attached to this, without recognizing there's an unmet need here, which is that they need to know that I understand where they're coming from, or there's some validation that is a need that's going unmet. And so if I validate first, then we can now go back into idea generation and they won't feel like I'm just stepping on their conviction. If I'm with an IJ, I need to understand that that sense of vulnerability is a big deal for them. And so I need to honor their boundaries and recognize that their boundaries are going to be very different than mine. And that if I step on them, I can't just go, oh, that's just that person. Like, that's just their problem. Like, no, it's something that's important to them, in the same way that if they were trying to imprison me, I would bucket that too, right? Like, I'd go like, you can't take my freedoms away. And so all of us have these, even if they're not fixations that are controlling us, they are definitely influences that should be honored. And another person's powerful driver function firm model influence is just as important to them as mine is to me. And in this way, it creates greater simpatico. If we infringe on these firm model fixations or firm model desires or nourishment, then we need to own that. We need to recognize that we would buck too if somebody was stepping on ours. So it just gives another sort of dimension of honoring other people's needs and recognizing that sometimes their behaviors aren't there because they're being obnoxious, but because they have an unmet need, and that maybe we can help them meet it.
I think there's also healthy expressions of all these. I want to be very clear that we don't paint a picture that these are always broken parts of who you are, or they're always negative, or they're always toxic, or they're always a fixation that's a bad thing. I think there's a legitimate desire for freedom that EPs have. There's a legitimate desire that, IJs have for that boundary or invulnerability. And there's a natural desire for IPs and rightness, and there's a natural desire for EJs and management. It's the extreme idealization and version of those, the extreme idealized version of those, that is the challenge, I think. That impenetrable invulnerability, that's the desire, and that fixation on that. I think invulnerability, being careful with what you let come in as an IJ is probably a good idea, because it's not like you should just let it all come in. That's not, I think, what we're arguing for here. And you can already see, if you see this, there's different levels of this, probably a gradient scale on like the most broken version of it to the most healthy version of it. But already in your life, if you're listening and you're running through the different types of people in your life, and you can probably already see, oh my gosh, well, no wonder my spouse or lover can't feel tied down. They're an EP. They need freedom. And here I'm an IJ, and I'm kind of a little nervous to go out and do that social event because I feel like it's an environment I'm not familiar with, and they want me to do it. Well, no wonder the conflict between us is here, because I have a need and they have a need, and it may not even be something really bad and broken. It may not be a fixation that's bad for you. It's how you're naturally wired. It's just another, like Antonia said, it's another lens, another way of seeing type and typology and how it shows up for you and the people that you love and the people you interact with every day. So this is just another tool that we've never really talked about on the podcast before. Another tool that we think is really helpful for you as you start to look at typology through these lenses and start to use it in your life.
Yeah. And if we went too fast, if we blitzed through these, and you'll have to listen to this podcast a couple more times to write down, take notes. Conveniently, this is a full chapter in our new book, which is it's a self-titled book called Personality Hacker. And we have a whole chapter at the end of the book on the firm model and some of our musings on it and some of our findings and the things that we've really sort of observed behaviors that come from some of these fixations.
Yeah, up till now, the only people we've talked about this with are our profiler training students. in our profiler training class. When they're typing people, they're learning how to sit down with someone and determine their type or passively profile somebody. This is one of the tools that we have used in order to help them triangulate somebody's type, as well as the other things that we've talked about, in previous podcasts. So you've heard this, and maybe you have a copy of our book. Maybe you'd like to get a copy of our book. Go ahead and do that. And there's got a lot more information about this. It's all written out for you with more detail, more nuance in the book. So that would be a recommendation for you. But we also want to hear what is going on for you. Has this resonated with you? Has what we've said today about the FIRM model, one of these fixations, is it showing up for you in your life, or maybe somebody in your life, somebody that you know or you associate with, a family member or a coworker, a friend, a relative, whatever? Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave us a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your story. Share what's going on for you in your life and let us know how this resonates with you. What questions do you have? Maybe you had a fixation at one time and it's been something you've learned how to get through in your life just naturally. And you've gotten to the other side, and maybe you could share some techniques or tips on how you navigated that in your life and the things you set up to account for the fixation you had at one time. We'd love to hear your story. So come over to personalityhacker.com. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And I do believe we talk about the FIRM model in one other program. I just don't remember which one it is. But getting through your fixations, getting through the things that are causing you challenges, and making sure that you are feeding and nourishing the needs of your functions and your personality type. These are all things that we tackle in our premium program. So if you want to go check out our program catalog and find a program that is right for you, we highly recommend starting on your personal development journey using personality type as a lens.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.